This is one of the easier RCs in CAT 2022 in slot 1. As always, let's look at the questions first. Now here we have a statement which is from the passage. We can infer that because of the quotes. And we need to figure out which of these is a valid conclusion to draw from this. So we'll understand the context from the passage and the relevant paragraph, and then we can look to immediately solve this. The second question is an inferential question. It's about the entire passage. We need to figure out which of these four options best describes what the passage is about. So this is a question that we'll solve after we have read the entire passage and we figured out what is the author's key message. Now, if you struggle with questions like what's the passage about, what is the purpose of the author, anything to do with the author's viewpoint, we do have a YouTube video and a bunch of free lessons on mockat.com. I'll put the link in the description so that you can go through these and improve your accuracy. This is another meaning question where we have another sentence which is given from the passage and we need to figure out which of these options is closest to what this passage is saying. So best expresses the claim is nothing but which of these is closest to what this sentence means. So again, as soon as we read this sentence, we'll finish off that paragraph and we look to understand the meaning in the context of the passage and that paragraph and we can solve it. This is a slightly tricky question. All of the following statements, if false, could be in accordance with the passage except. So the words if false just make it a little complicated, but when we solve this at the end of the passage, I'll teach you a trick which will make it a little faster. So this third question, what I'll do so that I remember this, I'll just note down one word. Here the word which stands out for me is abnormal. So what I'll do is, I'll just note down the word abnormal over here so that if there's any sentence which has this word, then I'll remember and I'll check if it is this sentence. Again, for this question, I would similarly note down maybe primal or something like that. But since we're keeping this question right next to us, we don't need to. As soon as we have this sentence, we can finish that paragraph and then look to solve. So now let's start with the passage itself. The context of the passage starts becoming clear from the first sentence itself. Stories concerning the undead. So these are stories and these are about the undead. They have always been with us. Here the author is not saying that the undead have always been with us. The author is saying stories about the undead have been with us. So we don't know whether the author believes in the undead or not. Let's understand a little bit more about this. The author says, out of the primal darkness of mankind's earliest years come whispers of eerie creatures, not quite alive, yet not quite dead either. Alive is also explained a little bit more, saying alive in a way which we can understand. So now this we can see is the sentence right here. So let's read this paragraph and make sure that we understand it. And then we look to immediately solve this. So stories about the undead have always been with us from the time of our earliest years. There have been these whispers of eerie creatures. So whispers of eerie creatures, again stories. So probably stories about these eerie or frightening creatures have always been there. And these are the undead. They're not alive, but they're not dead either. They may have been ancient and primitive deities, gods, who dwelt deep in the surrounding forests and in remote places, or simply those deceased who refused to remain in their tombs and who wandered about the countryside, physically tormenting and frightening those who were still alive. So they could be like, gods, or they could simply be people who refused to die and they kept wandering about. So, something like spirits or ghosts. Mostly, they were ill-defined. Strange sounds in the night beyond the comforting glow of a fire, a shape half glimpsed in the twilight along the edge of an encampment. They were vague and indistinct, but at the same time, they always terrified or disturbed humans. They had the power to touch the minds of our early ancestors and fill them with dread. Similar meaning. Such fear formed the basis of the earliest tales, though the source and exact nature of such terror still remain very vague. So these early undead, these stories have been there since mankind's earliest years. So they were basically, undead. They were not alive, but they were not dead either. They could have been deities. They could have been simply humans who refused to die. They were ill-defined. They were vague. But at the same time, they also terrified our ancestors. So now we've understood how the early undead were. Let's look at this sentence and let's look to solve this question. Which one of the following observations is a valid conclusion to draw from this statement? From out of the primal darkness of mankind's earliest years come whispers of eerie creatures, not quite alive, yet not quite dead either. So I just didn't go over the part and bracket again. But essentially what we learn here is even in mankind's earliest years, even in the earliest times when humans existed, there were these whispers or these stories of these eerie or frightening creatures. Now the good thing is if you don't know the meaning of the word eerie, it doesn't matter because most of these options are using the same word. We can also infer that eerie probably means something ghostly, something scary from the rest of the paragraph. So let's look at the options now. Long ago, eerie creatures used to whisper in the primal darkness that they were not quite dead. Now the mistake here is that these eerie creatures used to whisper. What we've been told is from out of the primal darkness of mankind's earliest years come whispers. So these whispers are coming from men or from humans, not from the eerie creatures. It's not the eerie creatures that are whispering that they exist. It is humans who are whispering these stories about the undead. So we can eliminate this one. Mankind's early years were marked by a belief in the existence of eerie creatures that were neither quite alive nor dead. This seems to be the correct choice because this is fairly straightforward. So mankind's early years instead of earliest years, that's close enough. There was a belief in the existence of eerie creatures, not quite alive or not quite dead. The same thing is given here. So this should be the correct choice, but let's quickly validate the other two. We can understand the lives of the eerie creatures in mankind's early years through their whispers in the darkness. Again, their whispers seems to suggest that it's the eerie creatures that whispered, and just as we've already discussed, that's wrong. Mankind's primal years were marked by creatures alive with eerie whispers. Again, creatures alive with eerie whispers. So the technique that they've used in all these three is they've taken words from the passage, but they've mixed it up in a hodgepodge together and they've changed the meaning. Instead of humans whispering, they've made it eerie creatures whispering. So we can eliminate these options and go with option 2 for this question. Now before we continue, what I'll do is I'll just take very short notes. Now when it comes to the undead, even in really early times, there have been these stories about them. So stories of the undead. And earlier they were vague, but they were quite scary, right? They terrified our ancestors, they filled them with dread and so on. These were essentially creatures that were not quite alive and not quite dead. I'm not writing it again because the undead anyway gives that meaning. So now let's read on and we look out for this word abnormal as we keep reading. And as mankind became more sophisticated, leaving the gloom of their caves and forming themselves into recognizable communities, so the undead traveled with them, inhabiting their folklore just as they had in former times. Now, these recognizable communities are nothing but towns, cities, whole cultures. So, from the really early or the primitive times, as let's say humans became more, let me put it as civilized, again we continue to have stories of the undead. So it's not that the undead were left behind in forest and in caves and all. The undead continued to travel with us. Now they began to take on more definite shapes. They became walking cadavers, so walking dead bodies, the physical embodiment of former deities and things which had existed alongside man since the creation. Some still remained vague and ill-defined, but as mankind strove to explain the horror which it felt towards them, this it is essentially mankind, right? So mankind is used as a singular noun over here, so all of humanity. So it is being used. So such creatures emerged more readily into the light. So as humans became more civilized, these undead became more defined. Now they're still scary, but they are a little bit more defined. So now we know, so they could be like walking dead bodies, they could be like former gods and so on. In order to confirm their abnormal status, many of the undead were often accorded attributes which defied the natural order of things. So this their abnormal status is nothing but the abnormal status of the undead. So humans, to confirm that the undead were abnormal, they gave them attributes which defied the natural order of things, which went against the natural order, such as the power to transform themselves into other shapes, the ability to sustain themselves by drinking human blood, and the ability to influence human minds across a distance. Such powers, described as supernatural, only lent an added dimension to the terror that humans felt regarding them. So as we became more civilized and these undead became more defined, to prove that they were abnormal, they were also given these supernatural abilities like living by drinking blood, being able to change their shape, being able to influence humans and so on. And all this was done to confirm their abnormal status. So now that we've understood this particular sentence, let's go ahead and solve this question. Which one of the following best expresses the claim made in this statement? Now, this sentence is simply saying that humans came up with some supernatural attributes for the undead, and that was done just to prove that they were abnormal. If we look at the options, the one which is closest to that is the third one. Human beings conceptualize the undead as possessing abnormal features, which is exactly what it is. Many of the undead were accorded attributes. They were given these attributes. Who gave them these attributes? Humans, of course. So human beings came up with these abnormal features for the undead. Remember, so far nowhere has the author said that the undead definitely exist or something. It's only been represented as stories and people's beliefs and all of that. So continuing using that line of reasoning, we can understand that it's humans who have come up with these abnormal features for the undead. Now looking at the other options, the first one, the natural attributes of the undead are rendered abnormal by changing their status. So the natural attributes are made abnormal. This is something which is really harsh. We are not saying that the undead definitely exist and they are abnormal, but we are also not saying that people have taken normal, natural people and made them supernatural. So this is quite harsh against humans, so we can eliminate it. If you've gone through the elimination module of my RC lesson, then you know that this is one of the common techniques that's used by CAT examiners. The second option is extreme on the positive side instead. The attributes which are given to the undead here, transforming, drinking human blood, influencing human minds, these are not positive attributes. So divine is something which is godly. So definitely this is not correct and can be eliminated. So they are not deified, they are not made into deities. Even if you don't know deified, but you know that divine is related to, God and it's a similar adjective, you can eliminate. Now looking at the fourth option, according the undead and abnormal status is to reject the natural order of things. So this option has taken a lot of words from the passage, but they've basically added a little bit extra. The undead have been accorded an abnormal status which is against the natural order of things. Humans are not rejecting the natural order of things by giving the undead an abnormal status, which is what this option suggests. So again, we can eliminate it. So as you can see, most of the words are from the passage, but the words is to reject or giving the undead an abnormal status means that humans are rejecting the natural order of things. This part is what is making it wrong. So we'll go with the third option over here. Now coming back to the passage, thus far we've learned that stories of the undead have been there since the earliest times that humans have existed. During primitive times, these were more vague undead shapes, but these were something which scared or terrified our ancestors nevertheless. As we became more civilized and moved into cities and towns, the undead they had more defined shapes and they were also given some supernatural attributes to prove that they are abnormal. Now, the next thing that we learn is related to magic. The author says, and it was only natural too that the undead should become connected with the practice of magic. So, the undead were also connected with the practice of magic. From very early times, shamans and witch doctors had claimed at least some power and control over the spirits of departed ancestors, and this has continued down into more civilized times. Here the author is putting civilized into quotes to help us understand that even now this fear of the undead or saying that there are people saying that they have some power or control is still there. So essentially we are not really as civilized as we think we are, or we're not that different from ancient humans. Formerly or earlier, the invisible spirits and forces that thronged around men's earliest encampments had spoken through the tribal shamans. So initially, these invisible spirits and forces used to speak through these shamans or these magicians who could essentially who said at least that they were able to control them. So the undead have always been connected with magic and magicians like the shamans and witch doctors and all. So initially they spoke through these shamans. Eventually, as they became more defined, they were actually these spirits who were physically summoned. So the undead were also connected with magic, and this was something which was there throughout. However, the relationship between the magician and an undead creature was often a very tenuous and uncertain one. So this relationship between these magicians, these witch doctors, these shamans and the undead, it is a very tenuous and an uncertain one. Now tenuous is something which basically means that there's a very weak relationship. But if you're not very sure, you can just use the word uncertain and just infer that the relationship is something which is uncertain. The next sentence helps us to infer why. Some sorcerers might have even become undead entities once they died, but they might also have been susceptible to the power of other magicians when they did. So this connect between the magicians, the shamans, these witch doctors and the undead, while they claim to have power over them, they could speak they could basically summon the spirits, make them speak through them, or they could physically summon them. This connection was a weak and an uncertain one, and sometimes these shamans or these magicians themselves could end up becoming the undead. So this is again one more attribute that we have about the undead. From the Middle Ages and into the Age of Enlightenment, so from the medieval times to now, Age of Enlightenment, again more like when we've had science and technology and not much of all of these magic or undead or similar things where we don't really have reasons, right? So we've come a long way from there. But the author saying in this entire time, theories of the undead continue to grow and develop. Their names became more familiar, each one certain to strike fear into the hearts of ordinary creatures, right? So they went from being these vague, ill-defined to more defined to these familiar names: werewolf, vampire, ghoul, and but each one actually frightens us. So that's broadly it with the passage. And now to answer the second question, which one of the following statements best describes what the passage is about? Let's just look through the entire passage. Now, in the beginning, we were told about the undead that were there in mankind's early times, how they were vague and yet they were scary, and then they became more well defined. There was also some connect which was there with magic and magicians, and this is something which has been with us throughout, from the Middle Ages, so from the ancient primitive times to the Middle Ages to even today's modern age, the Age of Enlightenment. We still have these stories or these theories about the undead, and they're more defined. Now we have werewolves, vampires, and so on. But throughout, humans have been scared of the undead. So essentially, this entire passage is more or less about the undead, and we are exploring people's opinions and feelings and the characteristics attributed to them throughout time, right? From the ancient times till now. So now looking at the options, the writer describes the ways in which the undead came to be associated with the shamans and the practice of magic. This is partly correct, but this is only a smaller part of the passage. So we'll go for this option only if all the other three are totally wrong. The passage describes the failure of human beings to fully comprehend their environment. This is an extrapolation, it's also quite harsh. It's not something which is given in the passage. While we don't really know whether the author believes in the undead or not, we can infer a bit because we've been told their stories. There's nothing about human beings having failed or anything like that in the passage. So we can eliminate this one. The passage describes the evolution of theories of the undead from primitive thinking to the Age of Enlightenment. Now, this is more like it because we've discussed primitive times, times when humans were more civilized, and all the way till now. Now, while the theories themselves are not mentioned, this is definitely a more correct option than the first one, which is only about a small part of the passage. So we can actually eliminate this one and go for this, unless the fourth one is even better. The author describes the transition from primitive thinking to the Age of Enlightenment. Now, nothing wrong with this, but this part, the theories of the undead or the stories or characteristics about the undead itself is missed. So anybody reading this option will not even know what the passage is about. So we can eliminate this and go for the third option over here. Now we come to the fourth question, which is a little bit tricky, but I'll give you a shortcut for it. All of the following statements, if false, could be seen as being in accordance with the passage or in line with the passage, except. That means if we take all of these statements and convert them into false, then one of them is not going to be in line with the passage. Now, to convert each statement into false is going to take a little bit of time. So instead of that, what we'll make it is, if true, if this given option is true, will it be not in line with the passage? So three of these in their current form should not be in line with the passage. Whichever is actually in line with the passage, that becomes our answer, because we're looking for the one which is not in line. So now looking at the options, the growing sophistication of mankind meant that humans stopped believing in the undead. Now this is something which is not in line with the passage, because we know that even now humans are believing in the undead and we are afraid of them. So this is something which we can eliminate. Now remember, this is about all humans. In case if we personally, if you feel that, oh, but I am not scared of all of these, that's not relevant because we are speaking about most of humanity. So this is something which, if true, is actually not in line with the passage. So we'll eliminate it. The undead remained vague and ill-defined, even as mankind strove to understand the horror they inspired. Now, this is also something which is currently not in line with the passage, because the undead have become more defined. Now we also know what are the types of undead and so on. So this again is something which is not in line with the passage if for true, which means that if false, it would be in line with the passage, so we can eliminate it. The transition from the Middle Ages to the Age of Enlightenment saw new theories of the undead. Now this is something which is actually in line with the passage. So this potentially can be the answer. Let's hold the option and look at option 4 first, and then we'll come back and convert it to false. The relationship between shamans and the undead was believed to be a strong and stable one. This is also something which is not in accordance with the passage in the current form, because we know that the relationship was quite tenuous and uncertain. Again, even if you don't know the meaning of tenuous, uncertain itself is sufficient to see that strong and stable is not actually correct. So now coming back to the third option, if we convert it to false, it means that the transition from the Middle Ages to the Age of Enlightenment, in that time there were no new theories of the undead. But we know that the theories continue to grow and develop. So this is something which, if false, is not in accordance with the passage. So this would be the correct choice. The other three, if false, are in accordance or in line with the passage. So that's it for this RC, and I'll see you in the next video.